When you talk about an LLC is actually a creation of the Secretary of State and absolutely tells you nothing about how the entity is taxed. So if you came in my office and you said, well, I've got an LLC, the next question I'm going to ask you is, how do we tax that entity? How are you taxing that entity? The reason is the IRS allows an LLC to essentially choose how it's taxed. So an LLC is created with the Secretary of State, just like a corporation or a professional corporation would be. Most people go with LLCs or PLLCs, which are professional LLCs, which are required in some states like Texas and Florida for licensed professionals. Georgia, on the other hand, does not require it. You have to look at your state's requirements. But most people are going with LLCs in order to avoid having the annual meetings and some of the other requirements that you have to do if you're a corporation. LLC, once you create it with the Secretary of State, you have a name, you have that defined, then you go to the IRS and you say, okay, this is how I want this entity to be taxed. The default for most LLCs is what's called a disregarded entity, basically meaning it would be taxed if it's one owner as a sole proprietorship or just on your 1040 personal tax return, or if it's multiple owners, it would be taxed as a partnership. Most of the practices I work with are LLCs, but we make what's called an S selection so that we tax them as S corps. The advantage of being an S corp is that an S corp is a flow-through entity that flows through to your personal tax return that also has some tax advantages that we're not going to address right now. We'll address that at another time. When you have an LLC, then you go to the IRS, you make the S election, and that will be your entity that you will practice in. So let's say the next step is you go out and you buy real estate. Well, I would advise you to go out and create another LLC. This LLC, however, will be taxed as a disregarded entity. So it will be taxed just on your 1040. It won't be a separate tax return like what we would normally have with your S corporation. I had a client yesterday I was talking about who was starting an entity, and they said, well, I want to be an LLC because I want to be a flow-through. So yes, an LLC can be a flow-through because you have all kinds of ways in which it can be taxed, but an LLC can also be taxed as a regular corporation, which pays tax on its own, just like major corporations that we buy stock in do. If you have any questions about this topic, which I know is a very confusing topic, feel free to email those questions to questions@mydentalcpa.com.